joining us today. It is an honor to introduce Idaho's 4 governors, Governor Dirk Kempthorne, Senator Jim Risch, Governor Butch Otter, and Governor Brad Little, here to share their memories of Governor Phil Batt. There was so much we weren't able to get to in the package about Governor Batt's life, his involvement with INL and his involvement with the Transportation Department. But Senator Risch, I wanted to start with you. You served with Governor Batt in the Senate. Do you have any memories or stories that you want to share?
I do. Some I can tell, some I can't tell. But look, Phil Batt was above all, I think, a fun guy to hang out with. And I think, like all of us, probably more so when he was younger. But when I first got to the Senate, he was a majority leader, and he ran for President Pro Tem against the then President Pro Tem and lost that race. And so he sat in the back row. The leadership sits in the back row. The freshmen sit in the front row. So I was in the front row, on the front corner, and he was in the back row. And we became good friends during that 2 years. But then after the 2 years, the President Pro Tem didn't run, so Phil moved up, and then I moved up. So we sat next to each other in the back row for the rest of his first time in the legislature. So when the debate drags on, you wind up getting to know each other pretty well. A lot of conversation takes place. But look, this thing has been portrayed absolutely accurately. Phil's first love was his family. There's no question about it. He really loved farming. He didn't talk about that very much. He really liked to write, and all of us have received missiles from him from time to time. Some very confidential sorts of things, and others not so much. And he loved music, and like I said yesterday, he loved corny jokes too. Much more so when he was younger. In fact, the first corny joke I remember him telling, I can't remember what the joke was, but I remember it bombed. The legislature was very different back then. This was my first year was in 1975, and we had been in session for about 2 weeks. Now, today the legislators go to breakfasts, lunches, and dinners, and sometimes multiple times. Well, back then it wasn't like that. They didn't have all these dinners and what have you. And in any event, he made a joke about the fact that we'd been in town 2 weeks, and the entity that was holding the dinner, he was congratulating them for the first ones to finally feed the legislature, although we'd been there for 2 weeks. It got the same reaction it got here just now, so that was not uncommon.
Were you at the
Yanqing.
Yeah. Where'd you have dinner? At that Chinese place?
That was Butch. You're talking 50 years ago. I don't remember where the dinner was. I can remember the entity that had the dinner. It was the Commission for the Blind that had the dinner. And I think they hold one every year. Have held one every year for a long.
They can be pretty long.
Yeah, they can be long.
Yanqing is still there.
And Phil, by the way, Phil was the master. They'd asked Phil to be the master of ceremonies at this dinner. So I don't remember where it was.
I don't think I've ever eaten there.
It's delicious. You're missing out. Governor Kempthorne, what memories do you have of Governor Batt?
Well, picking up on what Senator Risch said, first I'm going to say he totally was devoted to his family. I would be invited out to Wilder to their home. Jackie was great with the fried chicken. It was always wonderful food. But the kids, Bill and Rebecca, Leslie, they and then of course the family grew. But Phil was in his element there, and the family liked to laugh. So during the campaign of 1982, I got the call to come on out to Wilder again. And as I pulled in, no one was around. And I walked up the drive, and there was his car, which was now painted with bats on it.
The Batmobile.
The Batmobile. And all the family members, including Phil, were hiding, watching my reaction. So I said, no, I think it's great. Anything that raises the profile and the visibility of the candidate. He also loved music. And well, I'll tell you, those of us that had the great joy of going to the Idaho Hotel and Peter Schatz, and that's where Gene Harris would be playing. Gene Harris was a world-renowned jazz pianist, and Phil loved playing with him. They loved one another. And again, that's when I saw the joy in the eyes of Phil Batt, Curtis Steigers. He would play with Curtis Steigers. For his inauguration, when he became governor, his one of the wishes he had was that Chet Atkins would come to the inaugural and do something at the ball. He did, and then again, Phil Batt joined Chet Atkins on stage. Mark Dunn, a great buddy of Phil's, brought in Chet Atkins. So Phil was a world-class player, but also player by music. But also if school kids, school bands would come in, the governor would get the clarinet out also.
And he was genuinely good too. I saw videos of him. We had some earlier in the show.
Yeah.
He was genuinely good.
He was very good, very, very good, and loved playing.
Governor Otter, what memories do you have of Governor Batt?
Well, first off, rather than repeat everything that Jim and Dirk have said, I agree with everything they've said, and I could go on and on and on about that forever. But their comments about the music, I thought was great, because he was really in his element when he was playing music, and we would go out during campaigns. We would go out to senior citizen centers, me with my guitar, and of course him with the tooting that horn, and we'd go to schools. There was a lot of places that would go, and he always would comment later on, "You're no Chet Atkins."
Oh.
And I figured that was a compliment, because he was making the comparison.
And you told him he was no Pete Fountain.
No, I didn't. But I'll tell you what I saw yesterday. One of the most tender moments in that whole deal yesterday,
When he was lying in state.
when
in
he
the
was
Capitol.
lying in state, was when that guy played
Yeah.
that song.
He wrote.
This
on
was
that
a song
clarinet.
that Governor Batt wrote.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
But it was haunting.
Right.
You know, the clarinet's kind of a haunting instrument anyway, and it just sucks the tenderness out of you, because it's so mellow,
Yeah.
and yet very distinct. And so, he picked, for Phil Batt's character, he picked the right instrument to play.
It was a gorgeous
Yeah.
performance.
But I got a lot of other memories.
Feel free to share them. It's
I
just
will.
between us.
As
It's just
time goes
between
on.
us.
Brad's turn.
What do you remember of Governor Batt?
He was really a tightwad. I mean, he was a fiscal conservative from the get-go. When he took over the governor's office, and it was what we in our business call a hostile takeover. It was after 24 years of Democrats, it was Republicans. But every agency head, every legislator, everything is, we've got to lower the trajectory of the cost of government, moratorium on hiring new people. And he was that way about state government, but he's also that way about local government. And for these three that served in Congress, every time they voted for a bill that cost too much money, they perhaps maybe got a phone call.
I've heard of some of these legendary phone calls, and
But he was truly, people that don't think he wasn't a conservative, and I think he was also a conservative from the kind of the human rights side. Lincoln was famous because he wanted everybody to be able to enjoy the fruits of their labor, and Phil thought it was unfair for certain people in certain places because of their lot in life to not have an opportunity, and he wanted that trajectory in the economy and government not to stifle it. He cut taxes, he cut spending, he cut state employees, and anybody that cast him as anything other than but I remember talking to him about early childhood development, and this is before we did kindergarten and some of those other things, and I remember he goes, "Damn it, Brad, those little kids, when they're 4 and 5, their brains are developing. I don't want to spend any money, but we got to do this. This is the right thing to do."
I want to.
I was in the office when I was on his transition team when he became governor, and I was there when he got his first cell phone. And he didn't think that cell phone was a good idea to begin with, okay? But anyway, the next morning he showed him, "This thing isn't working anymore." And they said, "Well, did you charge it?" And he said, "Charge it? You got to charge this every night?" "Yeah, I don't want this thing," and he gave it back to him. But he didn't like it anyway because they were spending money on a cell phone.
Along those lines, he wasn't just a fiscal conservative when it came to government. It was also in his own personal life, too. And you had put together a proclamation for his birthday, March 4th, Phil Batt Old Geezer Tightwad Day. I just want you to walk us through some of the parts of this proclamation.
Well, I mean, Saturday was his birthday, and it was Idaho Day, and I had Capitol for a day, and so Kelly Statsky and my staff, I said, I just gave her a couple ideas. I says, let's write up a proclamation. I'll give it to Phil and Francie the next day. And then, of course, I was at the prayer breakfast, and I got the call that he'd passed away. And so I we had the birthday party for him anyway, and I kind of approached Francie about it. She says, oh no, read it. And, you know, it was a sad event. All of his old staff and a few of us were there, but the family brought it to the in-state ceremony yesterday. But it just talked about he got rid of Cease's Cadillac and was driving a Ford Taurus, and it just all of those don't surprise any of us about. There'd be some proposal to do something at the Capitol. Says, oh, I think it's too damn much money. And I remember when they tried to pass a bond in Wilder, he and I were going back and forth about what plurality we need to pass a bond. And he was almost convinced to lower the plurality. And then in Wilder, he said, oh, that was too fancy a school. They lowered the cost of school and passed it. Says, no, don't mess with that, Brad. So, but he really was a conservative. But he was, the word compassionate conservative should have been invented for Phil Batt.
I want to ask how his mentorship affected your leadership style and you served immediately after Governor Batt, and you knew him very well. How did the lessons that you learned from him impact your leadership?
I guess I'd say two quick things. One, I would be taken to the woodshed at least once a week, and as these gentlemen would attest, yeah, but as they would attest, he could just take the bark right off of you. But you talk about his writing, you'd probably get a little note later in the day. He had had remorse and was sorry about what had happened.
Sometimes.
So that taught me to develop the poker face later when I became governor, so that when you're dealing with some tough issues, you can just have the right face for it. The other example I would give is his compassion for the people. I'll always remember I was in the U.S. Senate at the time, but we were having terrible floods up north. We were in Orofino, and I was with Governor Batt. The Clearwater was just raging. And here was the major bridge to Orofino. And on the banks was a very nice home. But it was going to be taken off its foundation ultimately by the floods. And if it were allowed to go, it would take the bridge out. So Phil was standing with the family that owned that home. He consoled them, but then gave the order to the Guard, the National Guard, take it down. You talk about his heart being in the right place, standing with the people. He was always up front, but knowing how to make the tough decisions.
Right.
Well, first of all, governing is not something that the ability to govern, the understanding of governance, that's not something you're born with. And generally, they don't teach it anywhere that I know of, the civics classes and what have you. So when you're elected to public office, you have grand visions of the kinds of things that you want to do. And so you have to make a decision, what is the proper role of government? That is, do you want to be all-encompassing and take care of every problem that comes down the pike and try to be everybody's friend and create new programs and what have you? Or do you believe that government should do only what folks can't do for themselves? And that's a spectrum, and everybody lies on that spectrum somewhere. And so when I came to the Senate, I spent 2 terms as a county prosecuting attorney, but it was a legal position, not a governing position. You weren't making executive decisions as to what you should do or how to go about it or that sort of thing. So when you come to the legislature, which by the way is a great schooling place to learn how to govern, if you watch and listen to people who've done it for a while, Phil had, by the time I got there, I mean, he had this down. This guy was a master at governing, and he had the innate ability to listen to a problem and knew exactly where it fell on what we should or shouldn't be doing about it. And I think that's probably something. I mean, I got that from him very, very early on, and it still informs every decision I make today. Probably more subconsciously than anything else. But it's you either develop that yourself, which most people don't, or you pick up pieces of it from other people. For me, and I suspect for the other guys sitting at this table, Phil was a tremendous influence in that regard.
Governor Otter.
Well, I have to go back much further than when I first started serving with Phil. I was just out of active duty with the military. I just got home from Fort Knox, Kentucky. And a good friend of mine, Dean Summers, was the chairman of the attaché committee. So he came to me and he said, "Butch, would you like to be the assistant secretary and parliamentarian of the Senate?" And I said, "I thought that'd be a great experience." And I said, "Yeah, I'd love to." And that was my first introduction to Phil and that quick mind. Phil was a student, if not maybe the author, under an assumed name, of the 1 Minute Manager. If you had a problem, if you had an issue that you wanted to go in and talk to Phil about, you went into the elevator and practiced going from floor 1 to floor 3. And if you couldn't say it in that time, Phil wasn't going to listen to it.
I believe it.
Yeah, you know, there were times when I'd walk in and he knew exactly why I was coming, and he'd say, "Hi, Butch, thanks for coming." And the meeting was over.
He did
By
that.
the way, I'll send you a note.
He did that when you and I went and saw him in the hospital. What are you guys
Oh,
doing
yeah.
here? Well, it was nice to see you.
He did that when I went and saw him in Arizona, when he ended up in the hospital in, or not Arizona, California. He and Fran were on a trip down there, and he got sick. Ended up in Betty Ford's hospital, or one right next to it. Anyway, and I walked in with Ron Van Acker, because that's who Miss Laurie and I were staying down there with. And we walked in, and he said, "What are you guys doing here?" Didn't even say hi.
I believe it.
He was very impatient with things he didn't like. He was, and people who weren't who weren't very good at doing things. He had no patience there at all. You know, he wanted to get from point A to point B and not make a lot of stops along the way.
What kind of lessons did you take from Governor Batt?
Well, I mean, obviously, getting things done on an expedited basis. Like I talked about yesterday, he fixed the computer system at Health and Welfare for Cecil Andrus, his predecessor. Andrus just asked him to do it. He went around and did all the work. The state pension fund that all of us in this room are going to enjoy, he fixed it. Jody Olson said,
And nobody knows that. He doesn't get credit for
Yeah,
that.
he doesn't get credit for
but
it.
that was a huge thing for the state of
Alan Winkle said that he asked the toughest questions of any board member or any governor about what do we need to do to make sure that politicians don't dabble in Percy to their benefit or for votes, and that the long-term sustainability. So every local government, every teacher, every state employee will reap the benefits of Phil's hard work. But I do have to say one thing. You know, Phil's had some health issues in the last few years. Francie added years and years onto his life. His love for Francie, I remember that wedding. Phil and all of us are Republicans, but Francie's brother was a Democrat that served in the state Senate.
Terry Riley.
Yeah, and I remember going to Phil's reception at Al Henderson's place where we'd all had events, and there were Hillary Clinton stickers there. And I go, "Phil, what's his deal with all these Hillary Clinton bumper stickers?" And but it was Terry, but Francie absolutely. Phil was so happy when he and Francie were together. They had this connection of music, incredible connection. But Francie absolutely saved Phil's life because he had a back fracture. He had some other things. Francie took care of him, and he needed that.
She's a lovely woman.
I'm sorry, can I add one more thing?
Absolutely,
So,
please.
I knew what that wedding meant for Phil. Brad is absolutely correct. It gave him new life. And so my gift to them was, I wrote a note and said, I'm overseas. I happen to have been in France. I said, I've lighted a candle for you at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. And whenever I'm in a church that has candles, I will light a candle for you. And Francie came up and gave me a hug yesterday saying how much that meant to her.
That's so lovely. We only have a few minutes left, but I wanted to ask, just briefly, what are you going to miss most about Governor Batt?
Well, he's one of those people that he was always there. You didn't see him every day. You didn't talk to him every day, but he was always there. I don't think there's anybody at this table that hasn't made lots of calls to Phil over the years and say, hey, this is what we got. This is what I'm thinking. What do you think? And all of us stood shoulder to shoulder, obviously, on the agreement to clean up INL. Nobody put a finger on INL without calling Phil Batt and saying, "Hey, this is what we're thinking of doing. Where do you want to go?" But I think that's what I'll miss, and probably miss it the first time I think, I ought to run this. I'd like to run this by Phil, and he's not there to run it by.
Governor Kempthorne.
The fact that you have 4 governors sitting here, 3 former, 1 incumbent, but they're all friends. And a common thread is Phil Batt. Mm-hmm. And yesterday when each of us spoke, perhaps the first time I've experienced that all 4 of us were choked up. That's what he meant to us. And he gave us so many positive examples. And one of those is the fact that this friendship can go on. And I appreciate Phil for that.
And the weld is Phil Batt. Phil had a great attitude. In fact, it reminds me, he didn't say it exactly this way, but I interpreted it that way, that with your enemies and those people that you sometimes disagree with, they need love the most when they appear to deserve it the least. And that's why whenever you got a chewing out by Phil Batt, it was a note, or it was a phone call, or it was a knock on your office door. Say, maybe I was a little hasty. Let's talk a little bit more about this. And then you could get into some serious understanding of Phil Batt, the man.
Mm-hmm.
Governor Little.
Well, he really kind of epitomized our job about not getting too full of yourself. Don't take yourself too serious. You go around everybody, oh, governor this, governor that. Phil would make you humble real fast. Yeah. And I think it's what people in Idaho expect of their governors and their governance. That we still have that connection, which he always did. Kids, people far remote from Boise, Idaho, other people that would came in. He never was big on going to national meetings. He wanted to stay right here in Idaho and do his job. Don't get too full of yourself. And I know that's what the people of Idaho want.
Well, I want to thank all 4 of you for joining us to remember Governor Batt. Governor Brad Little, Governor Butch Otter, Governor Dirk Kempthorne, and Senator Jim
Let me say just one final thing. And I run this at the risk. I do this at the risk of if Phil was here, I'd get chewed out for it.
I believe it.
But Phil was my kind of rhino. He was a rational individual with noble objectives, and that was the Phil Batt I knew.
Well, we'll have you back to talk about that a little bit more, Governor Otter. Thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you for watching. We'll see you next week.